let's talk about the hidden acrostic structure of Lamentations chapter 5. Context. The Book of Lamentations is a collection of 5 subpoems. Each subpoem has essentially an acrostic structure. That means that for chapters 1, 2, and 4, the first letter of each verse corresponds to that letter in the Hebrew alphabet. So verse 1 starts with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, verse 2, the second letter, Bet, and so on and so forth, all the way to the last letter, the 22nd letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Tav. Chapter 3 is a little different. That one has a triple acrostic. So 3 Alephs, then 3 Bets, so on and so forth, all the way to 3 Tavs, total of 66 verses instead of 22. Now, the mystery comes in chapter 5, because in chapter 5, you still have 22 verses, but they don't correspond to the right letters in the Hebrew alphabet. The leading theory is that the structure intentionally breaks down in chapter 5, where you have the 22 verses, but you don't have the letters in the right order. And so as Jerusalem was destroyed, which is what Jeremiah is writing about in Lamentations, so too the structure itself of the poem is destroyed as you get into the final chapter. But it's worth noting that the number 5 is significant in Hebrew thought because the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is made up of 5 books. And so it would make sense if there were a 5th matching acrostic. Also, it's worth noting that if you count chapter 3 as 3 acrostics, because remember, it's sort of that Aleph, 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 Bet, 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 triple acrostic with 66 verses, then you would get to a total of 7 acrostics if chapter 5 worked out, which obviously the number 7 is significant as well. And so there's reason to think that there might be more to this structure than immediately meets the eye. This is where our good friend Phillips G comes in. Phillips G wrote this paper, Lamentations, the 7 acrostic, in the Journal of Hebrew Scriptures. We're going to walk through some of his findings. So the first thing that Phillips G points out is there have been others who've tried to put together an acrostic for chapter 5. The first being Siegfried Bergler. Now, when Bergler did it, he used the most intuitive method, which is just take the first letter of each verse, put them all back to back like we had been for the previous 4 chapters, and you get this message up here, which is kind of gibberish. Now, the reason it's gibberish, it almost spells something out, but the problem is you have these 2 ayins right here. These 2 little Y-looking letters. Those don't work with the message. If you replace them with 2 heys, which admittedly I'm not sure that Bergler has a reason to do that besides making the message work, but if you do make that change, then this spells out instead this message, which in English is the apostates, a people I spurn. He punishes with contempt as your God laments. Now, this actually is quite in keeping with the themes of Lamentations. It's a very dark book, but the reason I'm not persuaded by Bergler's attempts is because it kind of just discounts these 2 ayins that don't fit in with the message. This is where Phillips G's contribution comes in. He says we should take those troublesome ayins seriously. Instead of just changing them to heys to make the message work, he points out that the first ayin is the 17th letter of the Hebrew alphabet and also appears in verse 17. That's the only verse in the entirety of Lamentations 5 where the verse begins with the right corresponding letter of the alphabet, 17th verse, 17th letter. It's also the only 2 consecutive verses that each start with the same letter. And so it's almost like that ayin is an intentional signal by the author of, hey, this is kind of a separation point or a stopping point. Look for something here because this verse is in the right place and there's 2 ayins back to back to give you a signal. What does Phillips G do with this information? Well, he takes those 2 verses after 17 and 18, after those 2 ayins, which are verses 19 through 20. If you just take the first letters of those verses, you get this word in Hebrew. And then if you take a telestic, which is the opposite of an acrostic, it's where you take the last letter of each verse and put those back to back, and you sort of squish together your acrostic and your telestic of verses 19 through 22, you get this full message, which reads, your God is exalted greatly. Now, that message is missing an aleph, but the last word of the book is this word with the aleph present. So you get, your God is exalted greatly, and the fact that the book actually ends with the last word of the result of that acrostic telestic implies that it may be onto something. That's not all, though. We get some additional help from our friend Azriel Rosenfield, who identified a marking of a name from the first 2 words of chapter 5. Putting those 2 words back to back, you get the word Zechariah, one of the prophets in the Bible. And then, if you take a mesotic, which is where you read just straight down the line like this, in this case every half verse, you get this combination. So putting these together, you get Zechariah, and then up and down, the prophet. Zechariah, the prophet. So that's interesting. If you combine those 2 bits, Rosenfield's discovery from the first few verses of chapter 5, and Phillips G's discovery from the last few verses of chapter 5 after the 2 ayins, you get this combination, which actually is read right to left, but you get the idea, which is Zechariah the prophet, Your God is greatly exalted. Now, at first, I thought, that's not super persuasive. We're doing a lot of cobbling together to get to this result. The thing that's persuasive to me is that in addition to the ayins being in the right place and being the only consecutive verses with the same letter back to back, is that for one, Zechariah actually fits thematically really well here in Lamentations. Because while Lamentations is writing about the destruction of Jerusalem, Zechariah prophesies about the restoration of Jerusalem when the Jews will eventually be restored by the Persian Empire. In addition to that, if you take all of the letters of this, including the missing aleph, which isn't included here, and you put those together, you get a total of 22 letters, which would make it the seventh set of 22, just like the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, what's really interesting with this is if you take this perspective, then chapter 5 isn't being destroyed like Jerusalem was destroyed and all of the order is descended into chaos. Instead, chapter 5 is essentially led away into captivity, like the Jewish people were. You have this structure that appears to be chaos, but seated within that structure, you have vestiges here and there of order. And when you put that order back together, you get Zechariah the prophet, the one who prophesied about the restoration of Jerusalem. Your God is greatly exalted, even through the chaos and all the sorrow. But hey, that's just a theory. A Bible theory! Thanks for watching. I'm so sorry. I've always wanted to do that. God bless and have a great day.